maybe anonymous later on, but also if you can do that right now, how to burst into this.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's a good idea. Okay, so how would you like to lead off the roundtable? We have Mona and Deepti first, and you all have a joint presentation.
We have so the first 5-6 minutes I think are joint, right? Deepti, you there, right? You can hear me.
I can hear you. One second, just give me a second. I can hear you. Go on.
And can everybody else hear me?
So
Yes.
Okay. All right. So just basically opening up a conversation. It's just the start of a long, complex conversation, but we're trying to just make a beginning here. And Deepti and I have been engaged for the past several weeks now. Been engaged in these conversations regarding the question of Kashmiri Pandit and Kashmiri Muslim solidarity, and ways we can make sense of the existing, and as some would argue, and rightly so, a deepening political divide between the two communities. And what we want to do essentially is we want to make sense of this dynamic, right, existing dynamic and increasingly sour dynamic, to a rereading of Kashmir's political and social landscape within this prolonged history of Kashmir's occupation. And that's not usually the framework, right, people use to understand these dynamics, right? It becomes either about religion or it becomes about suffering, as we'll talk about in shortly. So for us, essentially, so the importance to rethink the ways Kashmir is taught and remembered, imagined, and memorialized, especially specifically among Kashmiri Pandits, after their departure from the valley, is a particularly salient one. And in a context where histories are being rewritten and memories are being rethought through multiple genres such as memoirs, novels, and films, we consider it imperative to raise the question of KPKM, Pandit Muslim solidarity, as a socio-political project, right? One that is critical for avoiding regressive forms of history and memory making, as well as for forging spaces where projects of social and political justice are not based on selective and decontextualized discourses of suffering. Because you often hear that word being thrown around so much that it's sort of lost its traction, it's lost its humanity, and all it's become is a political tool, a strategy, essentially. And I think we want to figure out ways we can transcend that very narrow status of the force of suffering in some ways. And what we find, as I said, actually, Deepti, do you want to jump in here and talk about Rahul Pandita for a second, and then we can come back?
We're talking about why this is important to us. And, one of the ways in which we're conceptualizing, whatever it is that we hope to do in the future, so we're talking about Pandit Muslim solidarity as positioning the Pandit departures, for example, or Pandit experiences as part of a history of occupation. This is not how the mainstream Pandit narrative is at all, right? Like the mainstream Pandit narrative, the dominant trope is, we were betrayed by our neighbors, right? And that's the recent sort of conversation around Rahul Pandita's memoir has sort of replayed some of these tropes, right? And these are the dominant tropes that, that we were sort of driven out by our Muslim neighbors. They were all united against the Pandits. We got no sort of support from our neighbors. Muslims were sort of complicit in silence. And, that silence, again, going back to, some of the things that you were saying about silence. Okay, the silence is understood as complicity, in the killings of Pandits, right? As though the presence of the occupation had nothing to do with some that might have even, been there, in fact, around the departures of the Pandits. And so, so we just both of us, when we were talking, one of the things that we had, I guess, in common was pretty good, saying things like, like my niece said to me, and she wasn't even born there. And so, there is like this narrative that sort of, has a lot of place in Pandit communities. And so we are invested in sort of institutions that narrative by talking about other kinds of narratives, right? Other kinds of narratives, perhaps even narratives of funded suffering, I don't know. Huma is going to sort of present such narratives at some length towards the end of our presentation. But the other thing I also wanted to point to is that, when I myself was in Kashmir and was speaking to non-migrant funders in Kashmir, the narrative of that sort of experience or the decade of the 90s is very, very different from what we hear from migrant funders, right? Who have left and sort of trade in a sort of narrative of suffering that again sort of uniformly projects blame onto Muslim neighbors and doesn't historicize the experience of the departures at all, doesn't want to speak of various complexities that funders themselves have been involved in sort of supporting the occupation. So I guess broadly speaking, our project, and one of the things also break down volume. Is that better?
Yeah, I think so. Let's speak so we know.
And so one of the things that we're hoping to sort of hear in this conversation is just talk about what do these solidarities look like? Of course it's difficult work, and I know that none of us are sort of naive enough to lapse into some kind of sentimental framework of like harmony or whatever. But I think solidarity, political solidarity can be talked about. What does it look like in the context of an occupation? And yeah, that's basically what I wanted to talk about. So, Roy mentioned the fact that these narrations of funded suffering that we are hearing increasingly now with Rahul Panita's memoir and several other novels and films and all of that are being made. To just bear in mind that experience is not really so in the interpretation of people's own experiences comes through certain kinds of narrative frames that we want to come to.
Can I jump in now, Deepti?
Yeah, please.
Right, so I think sort of talking about suffering then, I think we do want to be mindful to speak about suffering or find a different vocabulary altogether, because I'm kind of sick and tired of the word suffering without it anchoring in history and anchoring in certain kinds of complicitous politics, right, that we've seen from many different segments of society in Kashmir. So we argue, right, that then that suffering becomes this politically regressive discourse that's used collectively to silence the machinations of power and state and military hegemony in that region. And I kind of want to use this opportunity to really dig into an archive, a personal archive, essentially my grandfather's writings and his life. And I want to talk about the 1950s as a pivotal period in Kashmiri history. I do it through this important Kashmiri Pandit figure who was also very active in Kashmiri politics, Pandit Raghunath Vaishnavi, who happens to be my maternal grandfather. And some actually know him as the unsung hero of Kashmiri politics, the Hiruddin Saab's book, Bouquet, where he basically is trying to get certain histories together, unspoken histories. And he talks about him as an unsung hero, but some call him a radical humanist because he used to write for the radical humanist journal, M. Roy's journal, while others call him an extremist. Like Ved Bhasin actually does call him an extremist because he fearlessly championed the cause of self-determination for Kashmiris, even if that might have meant, at the time, Kashmir's merger with Pakistan. A stance that earned him the title of Pakistani Batta. And Batta, if people know, Batta is Kashmiri Pandit. So Pakistani Kashmiri Pandit, a Pakistani Pandit, which in and of itself is an oxymoron, we all recognize why. And a title that actually earned, of course, a lot of wrath. I mean, he earned a lot of stage wrath, but the family suffered tremendously because of that and continues to actually struggle with its, implications. In part because, of course, the family was labeled anti-national, and something, of course, that speaks largely to the kinds of limited discourses around identity, Kashmiri identity that are prevalent in India and Pakistan both. He was a lawyer by profession, but he spent 7 years behind the prison for his stance, and the stance essentially was that Kashmir was not an integral part of India, and that accession to India was temporary and therefore deeply disputed. And because of that, he actually earned the title Pakistani Batta. Which is interesting because Muslims don't earn that title. It's not a Pakistani Muslim, right? That's sort of understood. That's a given. The Pakistani Bata is sort of an interesting one. So he actually started out as a founder member of National Conference, but gave it up soon after because of ethical ideological differences with Sheikh Abdullah. Mostly his policies, Gundaism, we all know that, dictatorial rule under the guise of secularism and democracy, where there was no freedom for press or platform. And he was a prolific writer, actually, a speechwriter for Sheikh Abdullah. But in 1952, when he defected from the party, he started his own newspaper called the Jamhoor, which means democracy. It was an Urdu newspaper, an Urdu daily that actually Azad Kashmir had a program on. So I'm hoping I can find that archive in Azad Kashmir. And also with Mohiuddin Bazaz, he started the political conference party. And now this is interesting, and this is something I'm actually interested in exploring more, is as a party, political conference doesn't have the same sort of effective hold among Kashmiris as the Plebiscite Front does. Plebiscite Front is known for its pro-plebiscite politics, but political conference, for some reason, got outed as a pro-Pakistan party. And that's something I actually want to contest. I want to contest that only because I think it's deeply telling of the politics of the time, right? When even talks of peace with Pakistan were considered pro-Pakistan, right? So for instance, in a piece in Jamhoor, he writes about joint defense between India and Pakistan, and that's somehow being pro-Pakistan at the time. But in fact, peace can be talked about even without necessarily being pro one or the other. But what I'm interested in then is this category for Pakistani Bhatta that forces us to take into account the political sentiments and affective dispositions of Kashmiris in the 1950s, as much as it defines our commonsensical understanding of Kashmiri history. The neatly divided lines between Kashmiri Pandit and Kashmiri Muslim politics, as well as public discourses in India and elsewhere that see Azadi or self-determination solely as a Muslim aspiration. The category also forces us to confront a simple yet confounded fact of history, that anyone interested in Kashmiri right of self-determination should have taken into account that Pakistan was certainly a viable option for many Kashmiris at the time. So to brand political conference as a party that supported the total merger of Kashmir with Pakistan, I think, is a terrible distortion of a very important historical nuance. Does that point make any sense? Because I don't want to kind of build on that and get some feedback from you guys. So to call him an extremist because he fearlessly supported plebiscite and people's will, even if that could have meant a merger with Pakistan, is imposing narrow nationalist vocabulary onto a complex political scenario. A convenient feeding of people's aspirations, but also a forceful negation of self-determination, ironically under the garb of secularism, plebiscite, and democracy. Well, this is an extensive project, and I'm just beginning to dig into it with the help of my very amazing student here, who's actually doing a lot of writing and typing. And thanks to Salim for his immense help raiding the archive. But this is an extensive project that will rely on memoirs, journals, prison notes, letters, and telegrams to Indian and Pakistani political leaders, international bodies such as the UN. But it's interesting that I kind of want to read a little bit from his memoir. It's not really a memoir because it never got published. Nobody was ready to publish it at the time. So I think I have to take it on and do something with it. But it's interesting, right? So what I want to do through these two anecdotes is to situate the everyday repression of state policies on common Kashmiris who were labeled as dissenters or as threats to national security as early as the 1950s. And a lot of people have already spoken about that. These are two incidents. The first one is actually from June 20th, 1953, when political conference organized its very first rally, and it was widely attended, and Sheikh Mohammad Abdullah was the one who ordered his arrest, along with the arrest of other members of the party. And this is how he writes about it in that journal. He says, and I quote, "The fact of the matter is that there was no incident of violence, communal scuffle, or unlawful demonstration at any place in Srinagar before, during, or after a huge public gathering in the city when the Kashmir Political Conference was formed and announced from the platform on 19th June 1953. The response of the people was massive and spectacular. The government had not expected to see that surging Kashmiris would attend the public meeting and fearlessly yell Pakistan Zindabad slogans. The lanes and the streets of Srinagar became living rivers of humanity. The formation of the political conference had broken fetters. All inhibitions had disappeared and the people felt for a moment free from fear and the policeman's lathi to the town. The vanguard of the PC political conference were listed along with several other prospective political activists. The silence of the graveyard was restored all over the Kashmir Valley. Terror, terror, and terror were let loose among activists who were brutally beaten in police custody. The voice that could speak was stifled. The weekly Jampoor, the newspaper that he ran, was banned immediately after my arrest. Sheikh Mohammad Abdullah's government felt easy, but it was not a long respite. So it's interesting that in that context, and soon after Sheikh Mohammad Abdullah was himself arrested, which is an interesting piece in the journal that I'm not going to get into. But it's also interesting that this label of the Pakistani Batta actually translated into severe threats of life, to life, not just in the city where he was living, but also inside prison, inside the jail site that he was incarcerated in. So, for instance, in one of his prison diary entries, he talked about being branded a Pakistani by RSS agents who posed a persistent threat to the lives of political conference prisoners. He says, and I quote again, "Next morning opposite our cell, near the place where water taps and toilets were built for the prisoners, we noticed some human figures were drawn on the wall, representing Pakistanis, quote-unquote, who were to be beheaded by the RSS. We were deeply concerned by what were clear threats to political activists who questioned the finality of Kashmir's accession to India. And that was the reason why they were branded Pakistan. The jail superintendent visited our cell in the morning. He noticed the pictures drawn with charcoal on the walls of the toilet closet. He also read our mood, but simply assured us that the other prisoners, about 250 of them, belonging to the Praja Parishad of Jammu, were not violent people. The superintendent pulled us up and told us that no untoward situation would be allowed to be created in the jail. However, every morning the Praja Parishad prisoners would parade in the jail, 4 in a row in drill formation, and they would invariably claim the Pakistanis were to be eliminated. Given the surcharged atmosphere in the jail, the political conference prisoners were moved to the Udhampur subject. So the persistent negation of Kashmiri voices, either through incarceration or through the deliberate labeling of determined political activists as security threats or as pro-Pakistan, reflects this long temporality of repression and conflict in the state, which we must recognize, and Kashmiri pundits have to come to terms with that, and I think that's something Deepti and I have been talking about, that the temporality itself needs to be questioned, because oftentimes in Kashmiri pundit circuits, what you hear is something happened in 1989. I mean, nobody knew what happened, and suddenly they were taken by surprise, and that's why this feeling of deception or deceit from their Kashmiri Muslim neighbors. But the fact is, the rehistoricization, the retemporalization of the conflict hasn't happened enough, I think, in the community, and something that we need to really work towards. I'm not even sure whether that's the way to the project. But anyway, so essentially the idea is that what such textured anecdotes allow us to see is this complex Kashmiri Pandit and Muslim alliance that were actively being forged around questions of Azad and self-determination, and not necessarily around nationalist tropes that succumbed or conformed to India or Pakistan as two separate national entities. So in my larger work, I'm hoping this category, Pakistani Batta, will play a very important role. And I'm interested in exploring more through my future work how this might allow us to see the politically charged landscape and the incipient and highly regressive formations of Indian nationalism around Kashmir that were taking shape at the time. So not just necessarily post-1989, but starting from 1947 and even earlier, as Idris just talked about, and Huma mentioned as well. Yeah. And I think, just like any sort of label, the Pakistani Batta label, of course, does more work in terms of illuminating the political context of the time, right? The very charged, complex political context, rather than telling me anything about what my grandfather stood for. Because, I mean, one thing he did stand for was self-determination, and that doesn't necessarily fall into these neat binaries between India and Pakistan.
should we go to the... Yeah, I think Deepti and one of the points you've brought in about migration and rethinking and rehistoricizing, especially this myth that before 1989 everything was hunky dory. Now really live. Yeah, should we? Can you guys hear me? No.
Huma, can you speak a little louder? I couldn't hear Mona also.
We could hear you if you were here.
Yeah, Mona, Deepti, we could hear you if you had you been here. Thank you. Good point. You would have heard us had you been here. Hello, ma'am. Yes? Oh. Can you hear me now? Is that better? Yes. Okay. So thinking about that rehistoricizing, that was in fact like literally what I wanted to start off my paper with, is being that, kind of breaking down that myth that everything was hunky-dory before 1989. As if the Tehreek-e-Azadi, the freedom struggle, started in 1989. As if there was no prior history. And I literally want to take it way back, not just 2007, but way back. It's part of the culture, it's part of our oral culture, it's handed to us through Habahatin, poetry, even through Lal-Dad's poetry. The kind of, the yearning, the pain, the solidarity. So it's, I think we really need to recontextualize that. And also part of the shift of memory. What gets constituted as memory with a lowercase m and what gets constituted as a history with an uppercase h. That's also really interesting. And now, with the work with Christopher Snedden coming out, I feel validated that the story, my family history, is finally making it to a textual surface. Now it's legible. Otherwise it felt like I was part of a mythological structure. How in the world did our family, they were forced to migrate to Pakistan, from Srinagar, not just from Jammu. And Snedden's obviously done work on Jammu and the ethnic cleansing and the massacres and the rapes on Jammu. But people were ethnically cleansed from the valley itself. Even this myth of that women are only now getting into the freedom struggle post 2006, post 2004. That's an absolute myth. But my whole family was like that because my father's elder sister was very politically active, and she donned a burqa to go and meet Corbell, Madeleine Albright's father, who was there as a representative of the UN. All she wanted to say was precisely that we want privacy, we want self-determination, just like everyone else. We've been fighting against the Dogra rule for self-determination. We cannot be denied that, that's an inalienable right as a human being, as a political human being. And for that crime, she was thrown into jail for 2 weeks with Agha Shahid Ali. Agha Shahid Ali makes his way into our conversation with his eldest aunt. His uncle's wife and my aunt were both thrown into the jail, and Sheikh Abdullah went to see them and said, I'll be happy with just your husband in the jail. You guys need to go and be with your children. So, and I would argue that it's not just, my aunt or Agha Shahid Ali's aunt who was particular. It was that their mothers, their sisters, the whole community participated in taking care of their children, in allowing them to be politically active and have careers. They were all involved in that. So, there's another myth about, Kashmiri Muslims are now coming out and joining Azadi movement. Or the Bollywood myth that we want to be the secular India. I have been asked, in 2004, I organized a panel with Gyan Pandey, was the president at Berkeley, and Mohammad was visiting, he was doing some kind of fellowship at UC Berkeley School of Journalism. Mujtaba Ali, a lawyer from the Valley, was there, and he presented papers. There was a Ved Vatik, a very progressive, supposedly Indian leftist poet. The first question he asked was, दीदी आप क्यों आज़ादी के लिए लड़ रही हैं? आप लोगों का क्या बनेगा? Right, so the assumption, it's such an Islamophobic assumption that as soon as we get Azadi, we are going to go down the drain and as if we are not being raised by the Indian Army, as if Kashmiri, the men and women and children and elderly grandmothers are not already being targeted for rape and sexual assault in every possible way. The undercurrent of Islamophobia, I think we need to think about it that pro-Pakistan, just because somebody wants peace, does that make them pro-Pakistani? I think it's giving a hint of the counter, the reverse discourse, that the anti-peace discourse is built on being anti-Pakistani, which is a larger Indian discourse that to prove yourself a good Indian Muslim, you have to be anti-Pakistani. A Hindu Indian does have the power to be friends with the Pakistanis, to speak Indian nationalism, Indian faith, Indian Muslim. Never help us, right?
But that's, I think, what's not happening. Right? In the 1950s,
exactly.
People did not have that. Even as Pandit, he did not have
exactly
the liberty or the luxury to serve that kind of group completely. I mean, I think it's an interesting point. So I'm just thinking maybe it is a larger question that what is
before I just jump into about the
I think that the point is to sort of think about solidarities then through this project of rehistoricization, right, and retemporalization. I can find a better word, I won't use it later. But for now, I think it is about rethinking, right, and re-narrativizing the history of Kashmir, the politics of Kashmir.
Right, from all aspects, including what Huma was talking about. And I think what Mona and I are getting at is, what role have the pundit narrative, like the 1990s or the memorialization of the 1990s, what role have they played in sort of fostering this Islamophobic Indian nationalist narrative, and can we produce a modern narrative, right? So this is what to me is interesting about the narrative that Mona just presented, is that this is a forgotten history, right? That there was somebody like her grandfather, I forget his name, you'll have to remind me. But there was somebody like that, and he wasn't the only one, he wasn't the only pundit, right? Who was invested in Kashmir, right? Who was invested in independence, who was invested in sort of naming it as a disputed territory. That's something that pundits don't want to remember. And so, one of the things that we want to talk about is, excavate pundit narratives that sit at variance with this Indian nationalist historiography and telling of Kashmir, right? And that's sort of part of the project that Huma was also describing. Part of that nationalist historiography is to talk about, all of these aspects of, the relative recentness of Kashmiri Muslim women getting involved and so on and so forth. Or you're talking about sort of Kashmiri homophobia as some kind of uniform and exclusive thing. All of that is an aspect of a nationalist historiography. And the piece of it that we are sort of trying to get at and rewrite in our sort of project is, were pundits just colluding, or is there also another history to the excavation?
And there might not be as many voices. I mean, not to romanticize it way too much, because there might not have been as many voices either. I mean, there might have been in the minority. But the fact that that voice did not get leveraged, right, for a bigger political purpose is precisely sort of the silencing of history and silencing of politics, progressive politics that happened at the time. And with, of course, the state colluding in that sort of silencing. I think that's
so historians colluding with that silencing, right? The academics colluding with the silencing of history. That I find completely inexcusable. Right? Why does it take 6 to 7 years to account for a genocide, for an ethnic cleansing that entailed 500,000 people? That was proportionately the highest kind of ethnic cleansing that happened way beyond Punjab and West Bengal, demographically speaking, taking into account the indigenous populations, because Kashmir, Jammu and all, they're not very densely populated like Punjab and Bengal, but the population actually shifted the majority to a minority and vice versa, right? But that never really comes into conversation, into historiography. Why was it not written about? I mean, that is really, it feels criminal to me. It feels absolutely criminal to me. And I think another point about the Pandit and Kashmiri Muslim interaction is class analysis, which has been missing from the subaltern. I mean, subaltern historians have not looked at Kashmir. Why is that so? We need to take that into account. And they are accountable for erasure, silencing, ignoring a festering wound, an occupation for heaven's sake. And this completely ignoring the
But not just, I mean, I don't want to map sort of class neatly onto religion, right? Because there are clearly class divisions within
both communities.
Community and several other communities, right? There's on the periphery, Hamdi, for example, right? Right? And good joke around. But I think, yeah, and absolutely, I think to an extent it is, and that's what makes this conference critical, right? Is this notion or this sense of empowerment, right? That I think all of us do feel, and I'm hoping that people on the other side in cyberspace are feeling it too, that we have this opportunity, and in part an opportunity given to us by this sort of burgeoning scholarship within Kashmir, right? So I think we just sort of reaping the benefits of a lot of this sort of wave scholarship, right, that's coming out of Kashmir, a lot of wave sort of cultural production coming out of Kashmir, that's allowing us to also rethink and situate ourselves vis-a-vis some of these critical historic projects. And I think that's a really important move, and we thank people in Kashmir for doing that. And again, I mean, the bigger point is it's not just about Kashmir. We need to talk about that too. I mean, I've been working in Ladakh for the last 13 years. I'm working in Junaid now, which is whole another region within Kashmir. Cabeiri, I'm sure I can speak to questions about Kashmir. So I think there are those kinds of narratives we need to talk about, and maybe if we can do that, open it up.
I just wanted to, I think, I mean, this session for me is a very critical session, so to speak, because this kind of lays the foundation of the conversations we seek to have in future, and that will continue to try to seek in future through this forum or maybe other forums. We don't know yet, but I don't have anything prepared, but what I really wanted to talk about or sort of get a sense of, that I have been kind of hearing from all of you, is what is critical about this critical Kashmir study? What's the difference? What's the newness here? How are we thinking differently from what is already being produced? I think in the past 2 years we've been trying to form different collaborators, try and kind of have these conversations and flesh it out, and it's been an uphill task, it's been a productive task, it's been very enriching, we have learned so much. And I mean, here we are, and I think that's very critical.
We need to celebrate that.
Yeah. So that's one thing, but what I see, the conversations or the kind of little narratives that we've been gathering, the Pandit Muslim relations that we've been talking about, issues of race, issues of sexuality, issues of gender that we've been kind of talking about. The only thing, I mean, it's not a fear that I have, but it's sort of, as you very rightly said, that you are sick of using the word suffering. And I use suffering too much in my work because I work with unfortunate experiences, I work with mourning, as I was telling you when you should talk, I work with haunting, I work with ghosts, and all of the things that you were talking about, but in a very grounded ethnographic fashion. I am also sick of it. So my question is, like, how do I talk about suffering? How do I talk about Kashmir without actually engaging with the word complicit politics or something like that? It's kind of like pussyfooting around something that really needs to be talked about in a very tangible way. I don't know what I'm saying. I'm not saying that we have to go out and kind of like, just take these flags and kind of say it will be Al-Qaeda or something. It's not. This is an academic forum. I totally understand. We can do that, but here on this forum, we do have to kind of grapple with that. How do we really do that without feeling complicit within the academic paradigm? At the same time, like I do really subscribe to American anthropology, English anthropology,
English
anthropology,
glorious
but then I could use like article, and that's what I produce, and that's where it stays. That's something that we need to be talking about, and what that connects to is this very idea of fragmentation that's come. Everyone keeps talking about that there's a lot of fragmentation. I think we were talking about that earlier, and I think the entire the conversations that we've had today, they do talk about this fragmentation that we do not take as a category. And this is not present only in Kashmir, this is not prevalent only in Kashmir, it's prevalent everywhere, wherever there's hegemonic power, and it's everywhere. There is this fragmentation, but Kashmir does have a specific fragmentation. There is the religious communities issue and all sorts of issues, but it's always used as a narrative against what Kashmiris really want. And that needs to be grappled with. And I think all of us are in those conversations, and we just need to kind of keep that in mind, keep fragmentation in mind, keep historicization in mind, keep contextualization in mind. Because I think decontextualizing Kashmir from what's really happening, I talk about Parveena, but if I talk about Parveena, her tension, I talk about how she goes to the prison, but I don't talk about how she uses all this vocabulary to kind of make a political statement which she does not know because she can, in Kashmiri the word for politics is siyasat, and siyasat is considered to be one that you do in the legislature or one that you do in party politics. She doesn't really want to understand that, and she doesn't want to go there, so she doesn't use the word siyasat, and that's kind of used to say that she doesn't have any politics. So those are the things that we really have to grapple with. Those are the gaps where we can kind of fit in, because the other reason that I kind of think that this kind of like forum is precious because most of the people do come from Kashmir, and then there are honorary Kashmirians who have been there for so long that we don't know how to keep them apart. But these are the gaps that we need to make everyone sort of sensitize. These are things. These are the vocabularies that we use internally, and these are the vocabularies that are being used and kind of translated. And that's really very important, and that's what I see my work as kind of sort of adding to, and also this conversation adding to.
That was a very dense network of thoughts, and I got a lot out of listening to you laying these things out. And there are two things that popped out at me that I wondered, we might want to have like a more focused conversation about. One is what both you and Mona mentioned, which is there's a discomfort with the vocabulary of suffering. So if we can begin to name what that discomfort is about for us, right? Why is it uncomfortable to talk about suffering? When clearly suffering there is, right? But there's something uncomfortable about just reiterating like a certain way of talking about suffering that we want to guard against. So we can talk about that. And the second is like I love the question of what's critical about critical Kashmir studies. Right, like what is critical about it, what's new about it, what discourses are we attempting to shift. And I think we've already said that, the things that we want to talk about is like talk about this current regime as an occupation and all of that stuff. Beyond that, right? Like what do we want on critical Kashmir?
Can I say one thing to that? I think we were talking about this. Can you hear me? We were talking about it this morning. To an extent, it's not just rethinking vocabulary, rethinking conceptual categories, right? So Kashmir is imagined or spoken about. It's also actually finally having a critical mass of scholars who are working on Kashmir, who can actually shift the discourse. Because we see this happening, and Henry and I have been talking about this, and I've been having a Cabeiri with it over the years. The idea that, how do our papers get read by journalists, right? How do our papers get read by peer reviewers who actually are not informed at all about the complexity of the problem and will often use statist perspectives to actually undermine what is essentially very grounded scholarship, right? So either it's done under the garb of, it's biased or it's one-sided, it's not balanced. And that's not coming from political anthropologists who understand there's no balance in politics. But it's sort of interesting, right, that part of this the critical nature of it is not just coming from the ground up, but also from within the academic space, right? How do we shift that discourse finally towards a recognition that Kashmir does deserve a different kind of reading, or different kind of historic reading that does justice to its own history, situated sedimented history, and not imposed. Was that correct?
Right. So, I mean, on one hand, we're talking about shifting the discourse within the academy, and hopefully that's already begun to happen. And this conference is hopefully some evidence of that or a move in that direction. And maybe the other question for us to think about is, like, how do we make an attempt to shift the discourse outside of the academy? In some ways, to me that is important too, and I'm sure to all of you as well. How do you shift the discourse outside the academy? Because we can continue talking to each other. And I mean, in some ways, I think Mona and I have also been grappling with this, right? That we can present our thoughts on funded sort of dissonance with Indian nationalist narratives in a room like this, and it's okay. But one of the things that we've been talking about is like, who do we? If we don't want to get stuck preaching to the choir, what are we going to do?
If I can jump in, this isn't a direct response to this that you have to come back to, but I'm kind of inspired a little bit by the questions that have been asked, and I want to say a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing and how much I've learned about how thinking about the kinds of work you can say that come out of the economy, but we can also talk about intellectual effort among different Kashmiri communities have a dialectical relationship themselves with the kind of movements that emerge over time. And I think pointing to that in the sense of critical studies in the way that that's often been used to talk about locating movements within a particular historical moment and thinking about the epistemological kind of formation of those particular movements, I think that actually helps is really important. And I want to give a couple of examples from the work that I do just to kind of point to that. So I know many of you, but for those who I don't know, I actually work on the part of the former state of Jammu and Kashmir, which is on the Pakistan side of the line of control. I work in the Azad Jammu and Kashmir region particularly. And the groups of people that I primarily work with are with people who have the legal identity status of Kashmiri refugee within Pakistan. And I just want to say a little bit about who this is, because a lot of times when people hear Kashmiri refugee, if they know anything about the history of displacement at all within this region, what they think of is actually those people displaced across the line of control after 1989 who've been kept in camps in Jammu and Kashmir. But all of the people from Jammu, from the Kashmir region, from the Huma, the Valley region, who were displaced after 1947 to 1949, actually have a legal status of Jammu and Kashmir refugee within Pakistan and in Azad Jammu and Kashmir. And there's actually an entire electoral category to participate in Azad Jammu and Kashmir government that is given to these groups of people. And to the extent that this is acknowledged in any way at all, it's usually acknowledged in one of two ways. After 1989, people noticed that numbers of young men from these communities were joining many of the militant organizations. Sometimes it was the kind of secular Azadi organizations like the Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front, but they also joined other groups that were identified or categorized as Islamic militant organizations. And to the extent that they were acknowledged as not Pakistani at all, because many of the people who were told that Pakistanis coming to Kashmir in the early years actually were from these Kashmiri communities, these historical Kashmiri communities. To the extent that their kind of participation was acknowledged at all, it was often talked about as being a kind of a new ideological form pumped up by Pakistan in order to kind of mobilize this from people. The other way that this kind of categorical group of people is acknowledged in anyway in the academic literature tends, in political science particularly, tends to be as a kind of way of talking about further proxy politics of Pakistan. So it is claimed by a lot of political scientists, to the extent that there's writing on Azad Jammu and Kashmir political formations at all, as refugees having been institutionalized in electoral politics as a way for Pakistan to enforce control within Azad Jammu and Kashmir by using those displaced people who are residents in Pakistan. And by actually going back and looking at the particular historical moment whereby, first of all, people were ever categorized as refugees from Jammu and Kashmir Kashmir as distinct from partition refugees, and then by which they became an electoral category, one of the things that becomes eminently clear is that this category of Jammu and Kashmir refugee was tied to these older right-based and class-based movements from the princely state politics, whereby Kashmiri was a political identity tied to certain kinds of economic rights, like the right to hold land, the right to pay taxation in certain particular kinds of forms, the right to economy, etc., which was tied to state subject status. And their identification as different from partition refugees within Pakistan was partly about that conflict that was happening at the time. I mean, there was a kind of a UN and international interest in distinguishing who were Kashmiri refugees as distinct from partition refugees. But more important after 1949 is that this category was very explicitly rethought, remobilized by Kashmiri politicians of all kinds, Azad Kashmiri politicians, refugee politicians, politicians on the other side of the divided territory, as a way to distinguish its continuing territorial hold through the dispersed body of its people, even while that territory was actually politically divided. And so, for example, in the 1950s, when this electoral category is first institutionalized, it was actually not encouraged by Pakistan at all. It was fought by Pakistan. People went out onto the streets. They demanded the formation of this category, and it was partly based on the fact that it made sense on a mass political level because people knew what the rights were that went with being Kashmiri, and that right was being a state subject and having a claim on land. But for political elites, the value was if you could articulate Azad Jammu and Kashmir as a political space that would be ruled, would be for Kashmiris and ruled by Kashmiris, you could keep Pakistan out. And this became most successful and very, very important in the mid-1950s, actually after a massacre in the former region of Poonch, where the Punjab Constabulary put down, which was deployed there, put down yet another protest, killed large numbers of people, and one of the kind of political accommodations that was made was that in the future all government positions, including police, would go only to Kashmiri state subjects. So over time, now we look forward and we go, well, what does it mean that this category of Kashmiri refugee doesn't work with the international definition of what a refugee is? They look more like migrants under certain kinds of international understanding of migration and displacement. But over time, we can look at a tremendous political investment in this definition that actually doesn't track with other kinds of cultural forms. So, for example, Kashmiris living in Azad Jammu and Kashmir, who are these hereditary kind of Qawmi Bashinda, these hereditary residents, are largely not Kashmiri speakers. Refugees, the category of Jammu and Kashmir, refugees living across Pakistan and also in Azad Jammu and Kashmir, some are Kashmiri speakers, but largely speaking they're not. They're not basing their claim to be Kashmiri or to be a part of this on a purely cultural identity. And over time you can actually track a lot of aspects of confusion as well as political contestation between these groups around particular moments where there are shifts between different social groups about what exactly type of Kashmiri are we talking about at this particular moment. And for me, the critical work then becomes tracking out what are those moments of differentiation where people switch their claims, where Kashmiri started out being a political claim and suddenly became a cultural claim and suddenly became a descriptive claim on descent or on language or on the choices on mixed marriage and family. And by tracing those out, part of what you can actually mark is the moments in which different forms of power become, I think, the most important to people in these particular interactions, which requires also acknowledging their ability to reflect on their political condition and to use their self-knowledge and understanding of the way that different communities are actually going to read these words in different kinds of environments. So for me, part of the work, this kind of critical tracing, has to acknowledge something that I think is often written out in these stories, which is the ability of the communities and the people we work with to very explicitly kind of do their own critical analysis of the political world in which they live, and to remember, to recall, to re-narrate in a way that is not just looking backwards, but is also aspirational, about thinking about the kinds of political communities they want to live in the future as we make this sort of claim to common.
To sort of build on that as well, because those are not people who lynch me if I don't actually come out and say in public. The fact of the matter is, and this is exactly what I've struggled with in my own work, because I feel complete allegiance to Ladakh, I feel complete allegiance to Kashmir, I feel complete allegiance to a lot of communities who are not spoken of, right, in the mainstream. And the danger, of course, we all recognize, the danger in talking about Kashmir as a complex geography, as a complex cultural whole, is dangerous because it can easily fall into this trap of Indian hegemony, right? That India is asserting its claims over Kashmir by projecting, promoting it as a complex entity that can never be resolved, right? And that's a danger, but at the same time, I think we need to recognize that years of, whether you call it occupation, we call it structures of governance, both military and state, that have been in place, that has shaped communities, that has shaped indelibly their identity. So, for instance, the community I work with that I write about in the book, I mean, I can easily fall into this trap, oh my God, that is such a nationalist claim, but the fact of the matter is, they align with the nation, because they cannot align with Kashmir, because they haven't been able to align with the Kashmiri government, because they see the government as predominantly Kashmiri, right? And things have changed after the council and so on and so forth, but the fact of the matter is, there are grievances there. The political grievances, there are social grievances, and unless we take those into account, we cannot talk about Kashmiri aspiration being a singular aspiration. Whether we like it or not, we have to confront the fact that the situation on the ground is deeply complex. I mean, for me, Gopals that I write about speak about their identities through claims to the military, right? That's kind of how I keep getting these pictures that I'm tagged on, that are ROUNDTABLE stuff all the time, because that's a mindful, right? Where they're in their army fetters, and they're so proud. They're proudly claiming that militarized identity. But that's a structural feeling that I have to confront, I have to engage with as an anthropologist, recognizing full well that the larger context of the last 40, 50 years has been a deep occupation, right? Has been a deep, enforced grievances, deliberate to an extent unwritten. But the fact of the matter is that the situation there, we cannot necessarily assume, right, that there is a singular identity right now.
I just wanted to respond to this idea of singular identity. Kind of always not bothered me, but it's been really problematic because when we talk of Kashmir, and we kind of always thinking about the Jammu, it doesn't want to go to Kashmir, and Kashmir itself doesn't want to go to Kashmir, and then there's Ladakh, it doesn't want to go to Kashmir, and then there's other issues.
Kargil that has its own.
That it has its own politics happening. And then we can't make up our mind what to do with this certain region, right? I'm kind of thinking like, how do we think about it? And then here we think about it like division. So that's like how that's what I'm saying. I think that's what my paper is tomorrow. Or it's kind of thinking about the militarization and how it's kind of like ethno-nationalistic struggle to kind of consolidate India. Kashmir is a part of that process.
And let's talk about Indian independence. When was India united? Did India, before 1947, have a unitary, uniform discourse? No. Were all the people united? No. What about there were Sikh battalions, and there were these Gurkhas, they were very constructed militant identities, always constructed by the imperial colonial powers. That's the history of colonialism we're dealing with.
But that's a danger too.
Yeah.
That is a danger too, because that's precisely like my experience across decades that I've spent in Berkeley. The danger is aligning with the military, right, to derive that kind of national struggle. The fact of the matter is people are relying on the military for livelihood. Like, for instance, I am so worried about how my book is going to be read by Ladakhis, by Cabeiri, right, who obviously come out in the open to support Indian rule, which is deeply unfortunate because at the same time they also want greater Ladakh. they are rethinking balance, they are rethinking geography in ways that we must acknowledge, right? But at the same time, I think as scholars, right, and this is a critical part, this is the mindset, that we cannot shove these issues under the carpet. We cannot, and this is maybe, right, this is where we as academics fail in some ways, because we see so many complexities that we lose the sense of what is that revolutionary voice, right, that's going to bring it all together. And maybe we don't have to bring it all together. Maybe we can all exist in different spaces, diverse cultural spaces, diverse religious spaces, diverse geographic spaces, and still be who we are. But the fact of the matter is, these are historic grievances. Like the Ladakhis, they never wanted to be with Kashmir. There was an enforced annexation by the Dogra. Right? So they don't even see the geographic
Pakistan, right? It was a forced annexation by the
Absolutely.
Dogra regime.
Kargilis want Pakistan. Kargilis want, to be with Berkeley. Ladakhi Buddhists don't. So I'm not negating, I'm absolutely, completely in agreement with what you just said. But I think as academics who are writing, as anthropologists in particular, so we're unanswerable also to the community.
That's why I think
That's the mindset.
That's why I kind of think this was fragmentation. I kind of sometimes think that this has a meditation, wait or something. Because this is very strong. It's like I sometimes can't make up my mind about myself. Am I a collaborator? What am I trying to do here? It's such a fraught zone, but one doesn't really know. And I think that's the complexity of being a Kashmiri and being a scholar or being a person who is supposed to think about these situations. And I think that's where the critical part comes in. That's the shades of grey that we're dealing with here. And where I know that we cannot fix the collaborators in Kashmir because in part I think to certain degree we all are complicit in one way or the other.
In some power structure, we do sitting in the American.
Actually, I also wanted to bring back the discussion to what Cabeiri pointed out, the state subject, and the way the identity of these particular groups is built up politically, culturally, linguistically, aesthetically, the whole shebang. And I think in some ways, because I talked about it exactly, the closest analogy I have of that is, how people carry the key of their homes from Nakba, from the occupied territories. Yeah, sorry, it's, my grandmother kept a key of her home, of each home that she had, and because of the refugee status, unlike other partition refugees, they never got any replacement property in Pakistan. They started from scratch. And the keys and the state subject certificate works like that too. It works like a token memorialization of their citizenship, of a cultural identity, as well as of the right to the property that they left back. And apparently, even after these 65 years, those properties are under a particular different category. They're under a different umbrella, custodial property, right? And they haven't been given to anyone else. But within the parliament, there's always this discussion about, if they come back, do they have to stay there for 5 years, 6 years? What do they have to renounce? Do they have to renounce their Pakistani passport? When can they get their properties back? But that question is never really dealt with any urgency the way the Punjab migration is dealt with. That particular question of the Muslim refugees kind of gets shot every time when it's been 65 years or 66 years. So it's part of the silence chronology, the silence history that people don't know about.
Well, I think that might be a good place to close our roundtable because we've run out of time. We could continue these conversations, I'm sure, for a much longer time into the evening, but we'll close it there for now. I'm sure with the hope that we all share that this is just the beginning of many more critical conversations about these issues.
Yeah.
So I think our plan is that we'd like to maybe just work up a little feedback sheet and send it to everyone, perhaps as a Google Doc, a Google survey, something like that, just to ask for some of your feedback on the pre-conference, on the use of technology. This is the first annual Kashmir Studies conference. That's the idea. So we're hoping to be able to continue to use technology in different venues, different sites around the world as we move forward. So some feedback might be helpful. So we will now take a break for about an hour and a half, right? And then reconvene for a film screening.
Yeah, let's go.
So it's around 3:30 in the morning, so I think I'll
Thank you
come
so
down
much,
right now.
heroes. Thank you so much.
I'm so impressed of it.